Welcome to PAR Podcast, episode 74.62. PAR Podcast is an audio supplement for Public Administration Review, the premier professional journal in the field of public administration. In 2015, PAR will celebrate 75 years of furthering public administration research, theory, and practice. This episode features comments by Daniel Feldman, Professor of Public Management at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Professor Feldman discusses his article titled, The Legitimacy of U.S. Government Agency Power. This article is currently available in early view. Professor Feldman synthesizes the work of two political and legal scholars, Rohr and Lon Fuller, whom he contends properly balance constitutional and managerial values. Furthermore, Professor Feldman argues that agencies that reflect such a balance between constitutional and managerial values strengthen their legitimacy, a particularly valuable goal in an era of low confidence in American government.
I'm going to talk today about the legitimacy of United States government agency power. There are two scholars that both gone now, but that I would draw on for this theory. One is John Rohr. John Rohr was a public administration scholar of great repute, who wrote about what he called the soft power of American constitutional values. For example, he pointed to liberty, equality, and property as core fundamental constitutional values in the United States in some balance with each other. Now, hearing this, your instinctive reaction might be, well, what's this? It's verbiage, it's rhetoric. What does it mean? How does it translate into anything real? How does it actually affect behavior? And Rohr gave the wonderful example of France, which, of course, as we all know, the national slogan was Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. But under the Vichy government, allied with the Nazis, they changed the slogan to Work, Family, Country. Now, why would they bother changing it if they thought this had no impact? In fact, it does have an impact. These values, this kind of rhetoric does affect people's thinking and does influence their behavior. But Rohr went beyond that. He also argued that every bureaucrat takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so when there are those who argue, I mean, some of us, when we're children in elementary school, think the president is the boss of the government, and that's it. But when we learn more, we understand that Congress not only provides the funding for the agencies, but actually has the power to create, change, or eliminate their powers by legislation. And the Supreme Court, of course, deals with constitutional and legal issues raised. So agency personnel the president isn't exactly the boss, neither is Congress, neither is the Supreme Court. They're all the boss in some sense, but the ultimate boss is supposed to be the Constitution. And to the extent that bureaucrats form a kind of a balance wheel among the branches of government in this way, with their lodestar as the Constitution, this is the beginnings, I think, of a solid foundation in legitimacy, to legitimate, to justify the power they exercise, to the extent that they do that. Now, Rohr talked about those American constitutional values, but it's fairly clear to us that there are at least two other important values in the United States, but they're important values every place. One is security, by which I mean both security from personal security, so freedom from somebody attacking you or stealing your property or some kind of violence individually, or security nationally, some kind of reassurance that you're not going to be attacked and damaged in a war started by some other country. And efficiency, I would say, is the maximization of whatever value is important to you. And we usually think of that in terms of economic value or dollar value, but it doesn't have to be. Great example of the Kwakiutl Indians with their potlatch, where they destroy large quantities of their possessions to impress their neighbor, where sort of prestige is the value they're trying to maximize. But whatever the value it is that you're trying to maximize, you want to make the most effective use of whatever tools you have to maximize that. So in the United States, we generally don't want to waste a lot of money. We want to do things at minimal cost so we can achieve as many objectives as possible. So, but those two values, the efficiency and security, let's call managerial values. And this, there's of course tension among the constitutional values and even tension between the managerial values, but there's certainly tension between the two categories of value. Lon Fuller, who was a great legal scholar, made what ultimately is a very simple point, that law is there to serve people, to facilitate human interaction. And ultimately, whatever the constitutional values may dictate, if they are too violative of managerial values, public will react and will push back against that. And many of us have a sense of law that is those on top make the law and we obey it, or at least those institutions that are authoritative make the law and we obey it. And that's what's more or less the legal positivism school that emanates from H.L.A. Hart. Fuller offered the alternative, well, again, a supplement really to that, as law from the ground up, how custom hardens into law, whether it's traffic rules or commercial transactions, or a wide variety of other things. What turns out to be useful custom often becomes case law eventually, and sometimes even statutory law. And so the usefulness of law is key to Fuller's approach. If you put those two things together, the Fuller's approach and Rohr's approach, I think you get a kind of outlook that can and should shape bureaucratic behavior, and if it does, justifies bureaucratic behavior. We have examples of both ends of the spectrum. The lawyers who refused to go along with the Nixon administration's effort to slow down the desegregation efforts in the South and lost their jobs. They were told, well, the Attorney General is the law here, and they said, no, he isn't. It's the Constitution. And they were fired, but they did the right thing, and they go down as the heroes of the story. Not too long ago, there was a very dramatic betrayal of the kinds of values that the Rohr-Fuller synthesis would suggest. What in recent years I think has been a strong tilt way too far in favor of managerial values and away from constitutional values has had repercussions in a number of ways. The vast excesses of contracting out, which got us Blackwater overseas with the crimes they committed, got us Corrections Corporation of America, which and other profit-driven, supposedly justice-oriented corporations that have engaged in egregious violations of human rights and have not really saved money, and so on and so forth. But this mindset has actually affected our bureaucrats too, so that prior to the financial crisis of 2007-2008, you had an attorney general in New York who was going after lenders who were pushing predatory mortgages in low-income communities. And that was all well and good until he started going after Wells Fargo, Citibank, the major national banks. At this point, what's called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency stepped in and said, oh, you can't do that. Only we have the power to supervise and regulate federally chartered banks. So back off. And the Federal District Court and the Federal Appeals Court agreed with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. Well, why did the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency say this? Because they wanted to regulate these banks? No, they didn't. Actually, they wanted nobody to regulate them. And more to the point, they wanted to send the message that state chartered banks ought to get federal charters, because then the OCC could prevent any state regulator from regulating them. Why? Partly because the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency got funded by fees paid by federally chartered banks. So the more banks took federal charters, the more money they'd get and the more power they'd have. This is, from a managerial point of view, it made some sense. They wanted to increase their market share. The result was that this investigation was halted. Arguably, the result of that was the financial crisis of 2007-2008, which was devastating to the United States and much of the rest of the world. And that's because these bureaucrats were disloyal to the constitutional values they should have pursued. They should have been looking out for the interest of the American public, not maximizing market share. And so this, I think, one can adduce other examples, but I think that's a particularly important and vivid one. And I think in closing, I would say that to the extent that our bureaucrats adhere to the values inherent in the Fuller-Rohr synthesis, they will and do justify the power of government agencies in the United States. And that's my sermon. Thank you.
This concludes PAR Podcast, episode 74.62. To listen to additional episodes and learn more about Public Administration Review, please visit us online at publicadministrationreview.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at PA Review. Thanks for listening.